If you're not afraid of exploring the possibility that the authors of the New Testament were not who they claim to be, and the further implication that some of these theories could be flawed in some way, stay tuned. Welcome to Biblioccultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, history, philosophy, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Also, click the bell for notifications if you want to know when a new video comes out. Also, please remember to follow me on X. I'll put the direct address below. It also allows you to keep up with what I am doing and the books that I will be posting further on, etc. I also have a new merch store in which you can go and find some items that I've placed a lot of the artwork that I use for this channel and a lot of the quotes that I like putting out there from the books that I review. So if you want to support what I'm doing here, then go over in the link. It'll be in the description and check those things out, and I would really appreciate it. So in this episode, I'm going to go over a book called Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are, by Bart Ehrman. This edition is a hardcover from 2011 by HarperCollins. Now, I am aware that this book is controversial to some, and as a reminder, the way I review books is that I go through the book as a standalone, meaning I accept the book and take the book as it comes. I am not necessarily here to argue with the book, because the whole point of this is to encourage you to read the book itself, and even if I do some critique, the point really is for you to engage it and come up with your own opinions and your own perspectives. But the whole point of me doing a review is to give you mine. So I will do that in this review, but keeping in mind that I do like the book, that's why I'm recommending it. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything, just like I don't agree with every single book that I read. But if I like a book, it doesn't mean that I agree with it 100%. So diving into this review, an interesting reality when it comes to the Gospels themselves and the time period where they started coming up is that you do have a lot of alternative Gospels. And alternative Gospels by purported apostles. And you have a variety of them. Many of them are infamous now, but the fact is that there were a lot of these books. So just to start with, there seems to be an impression for some people that there was only a few or only the synoptic gospels were around, but the fact is that that's not the case. So for people that are not familiar with this book is going to open their eyes for sure. Now, Tertullian, which is a famous church father, also mentions a lot of books in the genre of the Acts of the Apostles, meaning another set of books by purported apostles giving stories and anecdotes about the lives of the apostles themselves and how these early followers of Jesus behaved and acted, etc. And that's a genre in itself within the New Testament, and we know it today as the Acts of the Apostle. So the citation of Tertullian mentioning this particular church leader, and now he had forged a book in this genre in his trial, etc., is very fascinating because the author is trying to make the case that the amount of alternative texts was actually widespread, and therefore what we have today is a filtered product. It was not the only alternative to choose from that the church fathers selected from a group of books. And even to this day, we have fragments and information about these alternative Acts of the Apostles. We also have the debates on the book of Revelation, which is, to me, very interesting as well, and I've read of this before. Some considering the book of Revelation itself to be a forgery. Some church fathers arguing that the book was either not from John or that it shouldn't be included in the canon. And I would say that the foundation of this book is premised and substantiated by the fact that church fathers disagreed and argued about the canon. And I found that to be interesting because he is banking a lot on the notion that most Christians are not aware of this. And the Christians that he's targeting would be evangelicals, Protestants, because Protestants are really the only ones that believe in sola scriptura, which is a quite recent phenomena, a very modern perspective in Christianity. So for those that come from a Protestant background, this information is shocking because they seem to have a belief that the Bible fell from the sky intact or something of this nature. And even those that are very educated still have a very particular viewpoint on the Bible. And a lot of their theology depends on this book in itself being perfect. So even the idea of debates on the canon of Scripture and the differences between church fathers could be disturbing. Now, of course, Protestants don't really follow the church fathers, because if they did, they wouldn't be Protestant. And sometimes they're even called heretics and deviants, which is ironic because their canon comes from the church fathers. So Bart Ehrman is putting a lot of the church fathers, disagreeing and even disparaging some of the books that end up in the canon as a point of fact to then direct the reader into casting doubt into the canon itself, which will be easier with the Protestant arm of Christianity than with the traditional Catholic or Orthodox, because to them, they're fully aware that church fathers disagreed, and they're also aware that the church is the authority to make decisions on canon. So once the church decides in an ecumenical council a certain debate issue and it's settled, then to them that is God also speaking, not only through the Bible, but through tradition and through the Holy Spirit. The author also points out that the Gospels themselves are anonymous, and we only have names attached to them through church tradition, but there's no signature or claim that the four Gospels are in any way authored by the men that are listed. So again, this also relies on the fact that for the traditional church, the authors are identified through tradition, through the history of the church. But outside of the Bible, there's no way of knowing who wrote the gospel. So therefore, if you're a Protestant who doesn't rely on tradition, then you would be really unable to tell who wrote these gospels. So again, the author is relying on this fact to cast doubt on the whole thing, because it's true, the Bible doesn't tell you who wrote them. The Bible also doesn't tell you a list of books that are meant to be canonical, which is the irony of the whole thing. You have to rely on the church fathers and on church tradition and on church authority to know the canon of Scripture itself. And you have to accept the authority and infallibility of the church fathers for you to even have a Bible. Now, there's a very interesting part in the book in which Ehrman goes through a history of forgeries and forged documents. I did find this very, very fascinating because it is the kind of topic that you usually don't read about. A lot of the minutiae and interesting legal battles and conflicts regarding this awful tradition of creating false books and presenting them as real. And I found it interesting that he mentions that some forgers would simply claim to have discovered a hidden book, plates of brass, in the case of a priest of Apollo who wanted to bring people into his temple, and he found these golden brass plates, and then he would claim it was written by Apollo himself, or in some other cases would be, again, a gospel or a book of some kind, that it was religious import. And with this claim that they would be able to then spread wide their forgery. So all this dynamic is fascinating. The book also points out that fiction can easily convey truth as much as history. And this is an important truth. I've mentioned this before in the channel, that fiction itself, literature, and just myth, and when I say myth, I go all the way from allegories to supernatural stories, which may be true, maybe not. But the point is that fiction itself, even if the author means a work to be fiction, it doesn't mean that it lacks truth. But historicity is a peculiar aspect of Christianity, because in the Christian world, certain aspects of the story in the Bible and in church history must have happened in historical reality. And I've mentioned before that the Bible has a particular historical requisite, that a lot of the foundations of the biblical religion requires those events to be literally historically true, because if they're not, it collapses the system. Not all systems are like this. Those that believe in the stories in the Eddas, for example, don't necessarily require those stories to be historically accurate. They're okay with thinking or believing that these things are true in the bigger sense of the term. But the Christian claim requires historical coherency. So, for example, the resurrection of Christ. It is not enough to see it as an allegorical resurrection or some kind of symbolic representation of rebirth. The resurrection happened in history. And if you deny this point, then you're not a Christian. And this was a very clear point from the beginning of Christianity. And the Bible itself reads as a history book anyway. Now then comes another large section of the work that starts casting doubt into the authors themselves, who they possibly could have been, and starts comparing letters from Paul and Peter, and starts making the case that Paul couldn't have written certain of the letters that are ascribed to him, and the same thing with Peter. And that entire section is very valuable. I think it's the core of his book, because he's trying to make the case that most of these books were written by forgers who were making claims of being certain people that they were not, so that they could trick or falsely attribute to themselves certain authority so they can push certain doctrines. So the very idea of the book is to make the claim that Christianity is a concoction of forgers with political motivations. And he also debates the people that make the case that forgeries were common, because there is the argument that it was common in the ancient world to write a book and attach a more respected name to the book as a way of either showing respect or at least to present a philosophical or theological point of view from the perspective of said author that was being attributed to. Now, Bart Ehrman goes through a lot of text here to try to make the case that this is not really true, that pseudepigraphy existed, but that was always considered to be dishonest. So a lot of the basic premise of the work is predicated on this as well. If the practice of writing books in the names of others was considered to be normal, acceptable, and even a literary category, then there's nothing really wrong with finding a lot of these letters with different names, even if it seems clear to a scholar, a textual critic, that was not written by that author. So if Bart Ehrman can convince you that this is not the case, and he gives you pretty good, compelling evidence of this, then it turns work that could be benign in just in a category of literature into a darker, more sinister perspective on the Bible itself. Now, when it comes to critiques of the book, I am not a scholar at the level of Bart Ehrman, so I don't claim to be as qualified as him to make a critique of his arguments. I can only make them as a reader, and if someone has read a lot of works on this topic. But I can't critique things that I know. For example, he makes the case that Christianity is a brand new cult in contrast with Judaism, basically making the case that a lot of the forgeries have to do with Christians as a new religious movement trying to somehow make sense and convince those that followed a more ancient established religion called Judaism about their theological claims. Now, this is historically incorrect, and I believe the reason that the author puts it that way is because it is part of an ideological infrastructure in which he still believes in, even if he's not an evangelical Christian anymore. He kind of does follow some of the standard evangelical Christian presuppositions, and therefore, even if in his critiques of the Bible, they stem from an evangelical Christian presupposition. So, like I mentioned before, his sola scriptura belief is part of the reason he critiques the Bible, because he sees it from that point of view. The same with his critique of sola fide. He seems to argue that Paul has an issue with a lot of the other authors like James, because one seems to be talking about faith through works and another one seems to be talking about faith alone. So he's making the case that there is an incoherency in the theology that stems from the forgeries. But this is also an evangelical Protestant point of view. He is assuming the position, whereas in the ancient world, no one believed in sola fide. And I know this is a controversial point. I know some people are going to get annoyed at it. I'm just saying, if you look at the history of the church and of the fathers, and I've read the fathers, there's no sola fide. There is a balanced view between action, belief, works, and trust in the process of salvation, which involves a synergistic, collaborative dynamic between the human being and God. This particular individualism and fragmentation and division between belief and behavior was really unknown, especially in the way that Protestants developed it. So, that being the case, because Bart Ehrman comes from an evangelical background, then his work is debating that. He's debating with a modern concept. He's not debating with the ancient world. Judaism is another example in which he assumes the position, and this is also Luther's error, that Judaism of his time was somehow the religion of the ancient Israelites and the ancient Hebrews. But historically speaking, it is not. It is actually a new religion post the destruction of the Second Temple. Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism are offshoots of the Second Temple, meaning they are a modern religion, modern in the sense of the Second Temple. So they're post-Christian era. So both Christianity and Judaism at best could be argued to be contemporary religions. One is not older than the other, but some scholars would argue that Christianity is older because a lot of Rabbinical Judaism is a response to Christianity. So their particular Unitarianism is a lot of times a reaction against those that out of the Second Temple became Christians. So these are important elements in the story, because if you don't know that, if you actually believe incorrectly that Judaism is prior to Christianity and somehow the religion of King David and King Solomon, then you are in for a very confusing ride through history, because it is not the case. So this is just to give you a taste that the book is great and very, very entertaining and very informative. But because of the presuppositions of the author, and we all have them, so every author is going to have this, it's going to taint a little bit the book, because an Orthodox Christian reading the book is not going to receive it the same way as an evangelical, because he is really more targeting the evangelical crowd. So to finalize, I think that the work is great in going into the minutiae of canonicity. And I think the entire work is really a debate with canonicity itself, because Christians got their text through the church and through church tradition and through the church fathers. And they also got their theology through the church councils, which is all the bishops and authorities of the church together reaching a conclusive decision on correct doctrine. And therefore the same way with correct canon, which includes all the books in the traditional canon, not just the ones that eventually were limited by the Protestants, because that's another interesting element. A lot of the books that the original church accepted, the Protestants eventually rejected because they went to the rabbinical Jews and asked them which books they accepted as canon. And because rabbinical Judaism went through a process of canonicity that is also somewhat contemporary with Christianity, the books that they accepted are different, because the Old Testament of the traditional church was the Septuagint. And because it was the Septuagint, that set of books is different. It's based on the Greek, and a lot of the ancient Jews also accepted the Septuagint. And the New Testament is constantly quoting the Septuagint. And if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of the books in the Septuagint are there. And by going to a new religion and asking them about canonicity, even though they already had their own councils of canonicity, and I'll put some of that in the notes, the Protestant church and all its derivatives accepted a new canon decided by a different religion as their canon. So the whole thing becomes very ironic, and then a book like this comes along and is trying to make the case against the very idea of sola scriptura, which again is fascinating. So very good book, very interesting and thought-provoking, and again, don't accept my critiques of it. That's just my perspective. When I really like a book, I go into a lot of the issues of it, and even the critique is my way of engaging the book and enjoying the book. And you will more than likely disagree with some of the things I said and agree with the others, and put them in the comments. I don't mind engaging in those topics. Again, to me, the whole experience of reading books is about intellectually digesting the information, considering alternatives, reading books that go against the book I just read, etc. So when it comes to the edition, like I always say, find whichever edition you can find. So I hope you enjoyed the review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. I would really appreciate it. So thank you for being with me. See you next time.